Welcome to Crosspointe.
Welcome to Crosspointe.
Welcome to Crosspointe.
We are an inclusive faith community
seeking to live out the loving, just, and generous way of Jesus.
We are participants in a long tradition.
It's less concerned with doctrines and dogma that demand total agreement,
but a life to be lived, enjoyed, and given away to others.
What unites us is a growing awareness that life is precious.
That we are made by love in order to love.
This community is comprised of and affirms the entire human family.
Regardless of race, age, creed,
physical abilities, marital or economic status,
gender identity, or sexual orientation.
So, if you're curious and have come to see,
if you are tired and have come to rest,
if you are grateful and have come to share,
if you are wounded and have come to heal,
if you're joyful and have come to celebrate,
if you are uprooted and have come to belong,
welcome home.
Welcome home.
Welcome home.
Welcome home.
Where can we run? Where can we hide that you will not find us? Deepest of depths, highest of heights, your love that chases us. No matter where we've been, no matter what we've done, we can't escape your love. Oh, we will never see the end. We will never see the end of your goodness. We will never see the end. We will never see the end of your goodness. Though we pass through the fire, or we pass through the flood, you will be with us. Though we walk through the valley, the darkest of night, your love will be our light. When we are in plenty, or we are in want, you will always be enough. We will never see the end. We will never see the end of your goodness. We will never see the end. We will never see the end of your goodness. In our darkest hours, on our hardest days, we do not have to be afraid, for you will never leave, you will not forsake the promises you have made. In our darkest hours, on our darkest days, we do not have to be afraid, for you will never leave, you will not forsake the promises you have made. And we can say that we will never see the end, we will never see the end we will never see the end of your goodness. We will never see the end. We will never see the end of your goodness.
Good morning, Crosspointe. Welcome to our online service. Kyrie eleison is a Greek phrase that translates into English into a three-word prayer, Lord, have mercy. And this phrase goes back in the liturgies through basically all of Christian history, not only Protestant, but before that to Catholic and Greek Orthodox churches. Basically goes all the way back. And this prayer never is irrelevant. I recommend it highly at any point, at any moment of your life. There's a song by Mr. in the 80s by the title, Kyrie eleison. And you have to have been born 60s, 70s, possibly early 80s for you to recognize this song. But if you don't recognize it, just imagine the most glorious 80s music production that you can imagine. Synthesizers, some great vocals from Richard Page, really high, very much better than what you're going to hear from me today, sadly. But I love this song because this treatment of that prayer, Lord have mercy, is so human. It talks about choices in life and the roads that you travel and even some regret, some wondering of, did I choose the right road? And the prayer with that, Lord have mercy. Will you go down these roads with me, regardless of whether they were what you wanted me to do, or it's all implied. It's not spelled out so plainly. But I just love this song. I think we can all relate to it. So it's Kyrie eleison by Mr. Hard against this mountainside, across the sea into my soul. It reaches into where I cannot hide, setting my feet upon the road. My heart is old, it holds my my body burns a gem-like flame. Somewhere between the soul and soft machine is where I find myself again. Kyrie eleison down the road that I must travel. Kyrie eleison through the darkness of the night. Kyrie eleison where I'm going, will you follow? Kyrie eleison on a highway in the light. When I was young, I thought of growing old, of what my life would mean to me. Would I have followed down my chosen road, or only wished what I could be? Kyrie eleison down the road that I must travel. Kyrie eleison through the
travel. Kyrie eleison through the darkness of the night. Kyrie eleison, where I'm going, will you follow? Kyrie eleison on a highway in the light. Kyrie eleison down the road that I must travel. Kyrie eleison through the darkness of the night. Kyrie eleison, where I'm going, will you follow? Kyrie eleison on a highway in the light. Kyrie eleison down the road that I must travel.
Hey Crosspointe, here are a few ways you can partner with us in and around the community in the coming weeks. First up, Kids Point is partnering with the Point Care Pantry to collect non-perishable food items from November 7th through the 28th. Donation stations can be found at all Kids Point check-in areas and during the weekdays at the YMCA check-in stations. The items that we're most in need of are canned fruit, canned vegetables, rice, pasta sauces, cereal, oatmeal, canned tuna, canned chicken, canned soups, boxed macaroni and cheese, and peanut butter, and also other non-perishable food items. Thank you for your donation. Now, we're also partnering with Wake County Foster Care to provide gift cards to foster families this year. Gift cards should be in $25 increments for family-friendly restaurants and retail stores in and around the Triangle. We will accept gift cards up until December 1st. Gift cards can be mailed to the church or dropped off. For a list of drop-off times and more information, you want to go to crosspoint.org/joy to the world. We're also partnering with White Oak Foundation again this year to provide gifts for families in the community. You can go to crosspoint.org/joy to the world. There you'll find more details on how to sign up, designated drop-off times, and shipping information. The last day to drop off gifts will be December 13th. Now on November 20th, we'll be having a live listening event with the music of Spencer LaJoy and Stephen Claybrook, Crosspointe's very own. They'll have everything in the courtyard from 6 to 8 p.m. at Crosspointe, and there will be a few food truck vendors available for you to purchase food. You'll want to bring a blanket or lawn chairs because it's going to be fun for the whole family. You won't want to miss it. If you need more information, you can go to crosspoint.org/concert. Tickets are free, but we want everyone to register just for the planning process. Now, as you can see, there are many ways for you to partner with us in and around the community, and one of the ways that you can do that, if you'd like to help us pour more into the community, is by giving. So if you would like to do that, you want to go to crosspoint.org/contribute. There, you can find a few simple ways to help us financially sustain the work we do every single week. You can also text CrosspointeNC to 77977. Thanks, Crosspointe.
Good morning, Crosspointe. For the last several weeks, we've been in this teaching series that we've called True Fictions, where we've been looking at parables that we find in the Bible. I quoted biblical scholar and historian Dr. A.J. Levine several weeks ago when she writes this: parables are meant to prompt us to see the world in a different way, to challenge and at times to indict. We might be better off thinking less about what they mean and more about what they can do. Remind, provoke, refine, and disturb. And so similarly, what we have to keep in front of us throughout this series is that we want to wrestle with what do these stories do in us together? Because frankly, that's what ends up making these fictional stories true, and how they change and transform our perspectives and our actions. Now today, I want to look at one that can be considered somewhat controversial. One of the ironies I find with people in the Bible is how some can be completely great with Jesus making up all sorts of stories to make a particular point, but can really get defensive if it's suggested that a particular biblical author could be doing the same thing elsewhere outside of the Gospels. For instance, when Jesus tells the parable of the lost son, he tells this story of a younger brother who leaves his family, wastes all of his money, and has to humbly come back to his father's household to try to start his life over. But when he expects to get met with punishment, he gets met with grace when he returns, and a parent overjoyed and thrilled simply that he's safe and that he's come home. And in 26 years of ministry, I've never had anyone get defensive or argumentative around the idea that Jesus makes up this story to make a greater point. But for some reason, when someone makes a similar suggestion about a story that we maybe find in the Old Testament or the Hebrew Scriptures, suddenly the conversation can become rather tense and controversial. And so in the spirit that parables are designed to provoke and challenge us, I want us to look at a story we can find in a book called Jonah. Now, when most of us hear that, we can think, oh, the Jonah story, right? And many of us immediately jump to oh, that's the Bible story where Jonah gets swallowed by a whale that they used to teach kids in Sunday school, or they still teach kids in Sunday school, right? And that's mostly all that we know about it. Now, to any of us where that's the case, here's a couple things I want to suggest, and I hope you'll hang with me for a few moments. One, this story of Jonah is incredibly challenging. It's raw, it's provocative, and even more so, it contains some brilliant, profound writing. And while we definitely don't have time to wrestle with more than just a bit of it today, I want to try to show you in the time that we do have why this can be such a powerful story. And secondly, by including this story in this series, True Fictions, I'm obviously showing my cards a bit in terms of how I personally think about Jonah. I don't think it's a literal historical account. I think it's a parable, one that's bent on satire that we find included in the prophecy books for a reason, because prophecy books, all of them were meant to challenge religious people in the way that they view God and view people. Now, please hear me on this. If you hold to a framework that insists that this is detailing a historical, literal event, that's perfectly fine. I've got zero desire to argue you out of that. However, what I find unfortunate is that the vast majority of the time, all the discussion I ever heard about Jonah growing up in and around the church was whether the story of Jonah getting swallowed by a huge fish could have literally happened or not. And that if you believed it literally happened, that somehow that was a measuring stick for how strong your faith was or how great your belief was that God could do absolutely anything. Listen, it really makes no difference to me if anyone thinks it's a parable or whether they think it's a historical event. Rather, the baseline for discussion that I actually care about is that we can agree that we can miss the entire point of the story of Jonah being told if we get hung up on whether it literally happened or not. And that we can agree that that particular argument ultimately doesn't make a bit of practical difference in any of our lives, whether one proved it one way or the other. It just doesn't. And so with that, let's start at the beginning of this story. Jonah chapter 1, verse 1. It says, the word of the Lord came to Jonah, son of Amittai. Go to the great city of Nineveh and preach against it, because its wickedness has come up before me. But Jonah ran away from the Lord and headed for Tarshish. He went down to Joppa, where he found a ship bound for that port. After paying the fare, he went aboard and sailed for Tarshish to flee from the Lord. Now, the first thing that we need to wrestle with from a context standpoint is why would Jonah run away and go in the complete opposite direction when God tells him to go preach to Nineveh? Because right from the beginning of the story, that's the exact opposite of what one would expect a prophet to do. Prophets brought God's message to the people that God wanted it brought to. That's what they did. But what we know from history is that Nineveh was a city in the ancient nation of Assyria. And throughout the 700s and 600s BCE, various kings of Israel marched into Israel, slaughtered thousands of people that lived there, and kidnapped over hundreds of thousands of people from the land of Israel and brought them back to Assyria. And so to many in the ancient Hebrew world, Assyria was obviously the sworn enemy. And so it makes sense that when Jonah is told to go and preach there, he's like, no way. And he runs in the opposite direction, because if you're Jonah, you'd naturally be like, God, have you seen what these people have done to my country? Have you seen what they've done to my people? God, have you seen what they've done to your people? And so Jonah gets on a ship and sails in the complete opposite direction of Nineveh. Now, as the story goes, while Jonah's on the ship, the author says that the Lord sent a huge storm. And the other sailors on the ship, they start panicking because they all believed in different gods. And so they all start calling out to these different gods and nothing happens. They start throwing cargo off the ship, trying to lighten the load. But again, nothing helps. And all this time, Jonah's gone down inside the ship and is sleeping while the storm gets worse and worse. And finally, the captain comes down to get Jonah. And he's like, what are you doing? Start praying to your God. Maybe your God will save us. And Jonah's finally like, listen, I know why this is happening. I worship the one creator God who made the earth and the sea. I'm the reason this is happening. Just throw me into the sea and the storm will stop. But that's not good enough for the sailors. So they start rowing harder. They're trying to get back to land. They're trying to save everyone's life in the story, but the storm just keeps getting worse and worse. And so finally, these sailors feel like they have no other option. And so they throw Jonah into the sea, and immediately the storm stops. Now, not surprisingly, this is pretty shocking to the sailors at this point. And so the sailors on the ship, they start worshiping Jonah's God, the creator God that Jonah had referred to. And what we're struck with in the very first chapter of this story is the irony that Jonah, the prophet of God, the one who is supposed to be the faithful one, is actually the one who refuses to listen to God, tries to run away from God, and has little regard for his own life. He's essentially trying to die rather than do what God wants him to do. While at the same time, the sailors, who are supposed to be the non-believing outsiders, they're the ones trying to save everyone's life. They're the ones praying to and worshiping God. It's as if the author of the story wants to make the point from the very beginning that things aren't like we would assume that they are. It's not as clear-cut as one may assume about who God is for and who is for God. That the lines we assume exist between us and them quickly get blurred from God's vantage point. So, after Jonah's thrown overboard into the sea, the next thing we read is the most famous line from the story, verse 17. It says, "But the Lord provided a great fish to swallow Jonah, and Jonah was inside the fish 3 days and 3 nights." Now, when I heard this story growing up, the picture I carried with me in my head was that Jonah gets tossed into the sea, a whale immediately jumps up and swallows him, and then the whale swims around for 3 days until Jonah decides to do what God says. And then finally, the whale vomits Jonah back onto dry ground. The text actually says that the fish vomits Jonah back on dry ground. But here's a couple of things worth noting that I found through the research of a friend and a Bible scholar, Jared Bias. In chapter 2, when Jonah starts praying inside the fish, he describes it this way. "In my distress, I called to the Lord, and he answered me. From deep in the realm of the dead, I called for help." Now, the Hebrew word, the original word there in the text for the realm of the dead is an ancient word we've talked about before. It's the word Sheol. It's the Greek form. The Greeks often use the word Hades, but it was known as this place of the dead, the underworld. Now, it wasn't a place for punishment, or it wasn't a place for bad people. It's just more so the state of being dead. And so the picture Jonah paints in his prayer is, I was thrown into the sea. I went down to Sheol. I went down to the underworld. And then I cried for help. That would have been the point when the great fish swallows Jonah. Now, why does this even matter, right? Another interesting thing though, is that this phrase, 3 days and 3 nights, this is phraseology that we see elsewhere in the Bible and really throughout writings long predating the writing of the Bible. The idea of 3 days and 3 nights really isn't about time. It was a way in the ancient world of talking about distance for a journey. One of the fascinating parallels that we find in literature is from a Sumerian myth called the descent of Inanna to the netherworld. Now, the Sumerians predated the Assyrians in the same area. Mesopotamia, Babylon, Nineveh, that was all the same area. And so this myth, you can Google it, look it up, is a story that would have been passed down through the generations of people there. And it's very likely it would have been familiar to the author of Jonah when he was writing. But in this Sumerian myth that predated Jonah by centuries, we find that the journey from the underworld by the heroine back to the earth and to the land of the living was described as a journey of 3 days and 3 nights. That's how long the journey took from the underworld back to the land of the living. So the picture the author is painting here is that Jonah wants to die, that he throws himself into the sea, that he sinks into the underworld, the place of the dead, and then he has this awakening. See, all this metaphoric language. and he cries for help. And then at that point, a fish comes and swallows him and carries him back to life. And essentially, Jonah went on this journey of transformation, referred to as a journey of 3 days and 3 nights. Now, just for a moment, let me geek out with you on one more interesting tidbit here about the writing in this passage. Because in the original Hebrew, when the fish swallows Jonah, the Hebrew word used by the author is the word for a male fish, dog. But when it says Jonah prays inside the belly of the fish, the author changes the words to a female fish, daga. And then when Jonah gets spit back out onto dry land, the author returns to the masculine form, dog. So here's the picture. When Jonah is praying inside the fish, crying out for help, when he's waking up in a sense, it's as if he's getting rebirthed. And there's all sorts of womb and birth imagery in this prayer. It seems that this is why the author switches to the word for a female fish rather than a male fish during this part of the story. It's because this fish is the vehicle God is using to literally and figuratively save Jonah, to try to wake him up, to transform his thinking, to lead him to a new birth. Personally, I think that's some extremely compelling metaphors and some crazy good writing. But still, it gets better. Now, most scholars think that Jonah was written sometime after 539 BCE, when we know from history that the Israelites were freed from exile in Babylon and Assyria. Again, all that same area. And they're allowed to go back home after they had been exiled for over 70 years. Now, over the course of those 70 years, many Israelites had raised children and buried relatives there in Assyria. It had become home to many of them. It's what they now knew. It's all they knew. And to the extent that even after that they were set free, many Israelites, we know from history, chose to stay in Assyria and make their home there. So the question that's being wrestled with by the author of Jonah is, how do we think God views people that are different than us? I mean, after all, Israel was supposed to be, or thought of themselves as, God's chosen people. Assyria is the enemy, who obviously generations before had done horrific things. But is God just the God of us, or is God the God of everyone? That's the question that's lurking in the background over and over again in the story. Now, the author starts out chapter 3 of the story this way. It says, "Then the word of the Lord came to Jonah a second time. Go to the great city of Nineveh and proclaim to it the message I give you." So if you remember, chapter 3 starts nearly the same way as chapter 1, the very beginning of the story. And so it's framed as this second chance for Jonah. And then we read this in verse 3. It says, "Jonah obeyed the word of the Lord and went to Nineveh." Now, Nineveh was a very large city. It took 3 days to go through. Jonah began by going a day's journey into the city, proclaiming, 40 more days and Nineveh will be overthrown. Now, another thing Bias points out in his research is that the Hebrew word that gets translated into the English here as overthrown is quite intriguing from a writing perspective, because the meaning of the word in Hebrew is rather ambiguous. It can mean one of two things. It can mean overthrown in terms of being overturned and destroyed, or it can mean turned over and changed, transformed. It really can be read and understood either way in the Hebrew. And so at this point in the story, when the reader's reading it, it creates some drama. How is Jonah going to respond? Which way is Jonah going to interpret this message from God? Will he want them destroyed, or will he want them changed? See, there's this drama, there's this tension that gets set up in the story. But again, here's why the parable is so provoking, because it's not just a question for Jonah. It's a question for the original hearers of this story. What in your hearts do you want for the people of Assyria? Yet even more challenging to us personally, it's a question for you and I, right? When we start to see ourselves as the special ones, where in our minds, we're the good ones for whatever reason, or we're the correct ones, the ones in the right. And this person, this group over here, they're the bad ones, they're the wrong ones, they're the ones who keep getting it wrong. We have to wrestle with. Do we want to see those other people punished or restored? Do we want vengeance or repentance for them? Do we want them destroyed and humiliated, or do we want them healed, transformed, changed? And friends, please hear me. When we don't live in a world of theory and ideals, if we're honest, I think that's a really hard question. Along with, what do we actually want from God? And I think that's a big part of the point of this story. Because when we think about that person or those people who have hurt and wounded us the most, who have betrayed you the most, who have shamed and abused and mocked and abandoned us the most, who we've been taught to fear and hate and be disgusted by the most, there's a sense of justice and rightness that can appropriately rise up in us. But if we're not awake to it, we need to realize that there's a razor thin line between a desire for justice and a desire to destroy. And that's where this author of Jonah gets it. Where again, keep in mind, he had experienced or at least heard the stories of loved ones who had been killed, raped, kidnapped, and enslaved at the hands of the people of Nineveh. So this is an honest and raw struggle. This is the real deal. And the author is pointing the same question back to his fellow Israelites of his day who had endured the same, reflecting back on what has happened to his own ancestors, and yet trying to wrestle with the human beings that he sees and now knows right in front of him currently. And so he crafts this story to illustrate that tension. And as the story continues, Jonah preaches the message that God sent to him to preach to the Ninevites. And in the story, the Ninevites actually repent. They turn from their evil ways and they decide to change and follow God. And then the story says God had compassion on them and chose not to destroy them. And that's where I want us to pick it up in the text. And I want us to follow it along to the end. Here's how it goes. Chapter 4, verse 1, it says, "But to Jonah, this seemed very wrong," the idea that God had compassion on them. "And Jonah became angry. He prayed to the Lord, 'Isn't this what I said, Lord, when I was still at home? That is what I tried to forestall by fleeing to Tarshish. I knew,'" and he quotes Exodus here, "'I knew that you are a gracious and compassionate God, slow to anger and abounding in love, a God who relents from sending calamity. Now, Lord, take away my life, for it is better for me to die than to live.' But the Lord replied, 'Is it right for you to be angry?'" Isn't that a great question? I love that. Is it right for you to be angry? Jonah had gone out and sat down at a place east of the city. There he made himself a shelter, sat in its shade, and waited to see what would happen to the city. And so basically Jonah's ticked off and decides, you know what? I'm going to sit here and I'm going to wait for God to change his mind and do to Nineveh what it deserves. Rain down fire from heaven, giant lightning bolts, whatever it takes to destroy the city. That's what needs to happen. That's what God should do. And I want a comfortable seat to watch the whole thing go down when God changes his mind. And so Jonah goes to sit and wait and watch, because the assumption is, God, you're really not going to let them get away with everything they've done, right? I mean, you're going to make sure they get theirs, right? Surely you're going to torch them or something, right? I mean, Nineveh is the enemy and they deserve to get paid back. But here's how the story concludes. Verse 6. "Then the Lord God provided a leafy plant and made it grow up over Jonah to give shade for his head to ease his discomfort. And Jonah was very happy about the plant. But at dawn the next day, God provided a worm which chewed the plant so that it withered. When the sun rose, God provided a scorching east wind, and the sun blazed on Jonah's head so that he grew faint. He wanted to die and said, 'It would be better for me to die than to live.' But God said to Jonah, 'Is it right for you to be angry about the plant?' 'It is,' he said, 'and I'm so angry I wish I were dead.' But the Lord said, 'You have been concerned about this plant, though you did not tend it or make it grow. It sprang up overnight and died overnight. And should I not have concern for the great city of Nineveh, in which there are more than 120,000 people who cannot tell their right hand from their left, and also many animals?'" And then that's how the story ends. That abruptly, with just a question from God that just hangs there with no answer. Just a question to wrestle with. if Jonah could be so concerned about a one-day-old plant dying that Jonah didn't create, does God have the right as creator to be concerned about the lives of 120,000 people and their animals that God did create and that have lost their way? That's the question left in the reader's lap. Now, as I start to wrap up here, there's one more literary aspect of this chapter that I want to draw your attention to. Jonah is essentially debating God in this last chapter. And in this debate, Jonah is advocating for God to bring what Jonah thinks is justice. And God is pushing back and advocating for seeing these people as fellow human beings that God has created. So it's this tension back and forth between this demand for a vengeful justice and a case for compassion. And so once again, I want you to see how brilliant the writing is. I've been studying and teaching on Jonah for 26 years, and until Jared Bias pointed this out in his research recently, I hadn't noticed it before. But in the original Hebrew language Jonah was written in this last chapter, Jonah speaks 47 words in Hebrew, and God speaks 47 words in Hebrew. In fact, when you break it down, the structure of the debate in chapter 4 goes like this. Jonah gets the first 39 words, then God responds with 3. Jonah comes back with 3 words, then God comes back with 5 words. Jonah returns 5 words, and then God concludes with 39 words. 47 words for God, 47 words for Jonah. I don't know about you, but for me, that's the kind of stuff that makes me in awe of what some of these ancient biblical writers were doing and why these stories have held up for thousands of years. Now, when we consider that built-in structure, there's a lot we can try to infer from that style of writing, but perhaps one thing could simply be that the author is trying to illustrate that, of course, there's an obvious tension between our desire for justice and holding space for compassion. That with 47 words appropriated to each argument, there's validity in both perspectives that can't be easily dismissed. And I find the affirmation of that kind of raw honesty rather refreshing and comforting, because that same struggle exists in me. And yet it also can't be ignored that God does get the final say in the debate. God gets the last 39 words. And it's a positioning of God's grace and love as ultimately having that final say. And I think it sits as this challenge to the original readers of the story that perhaps God's mercy and love is bigger and more inclusive than they had all previously thought. And yet, not surprisingly, thousands of years later, that same challenge exists for you and I. Perhaps God is bigger and more expansive in God's love and grace than many of us originally thought. Now, to be clear, the story doesn't try to answer how we go about trying to balance mercy and justice in our own day-to-day lives and in society in every situation. It isn't trying to answer the story how we stand up for and advocate for justice when people have been and are being mistreated and oppressed, and not letting it cross over to vengeance and revenge in our own heart. This story isn't trying to address all of that. And those are all valid questions and things to wrestle with. But what it does do is it raises some critically important questions about how we view God, about how we view others, and what God thinks of our categories of us and them, and ultimately what love looks like. So friends, here's my hope. I hope this story of Jonah messes with us in all the right kinds of ways. I hope it provokes us to honestly wrestle with what we ultimately want to see happen to those who have wronged us. That will help us wrestle with our desire for justice and our desire for mercy and the thin lines that can separate both of those good things from corrupted, distorted versions of the same. And I hope it challenges our views on just how expansive and deep and wide and inclusive the love of God is for all creation. And then I hope it challenges us on how we seek to live out that love of God to everyone and all creation around us. How to stand up with and for others when others try to declare that they don't fall under that expansive love and care of God. And that instead, want to declare themselves as exclusively special somehow? What does it look like to stand up and to advocate for those that fall under that oppression? And I pray that in that process, God uses all of that wrestling to rescue us from the places in our own hearts that have died. That we would allow God to take us on a journey to redeem and transform us and experience a new kind of rebirth in how we view God, how we view others, and how we view the world. So friends, may this story change us for the better, because that's what the best kind of stories do. You're loved, Crosspointe, and here's to extending that same love to others. See you next week.
Thank you for joining us today, and welcome home. If you are in need of assistance during this crisis, please reach out at crosspoint.org/help.